Hi, MS translators, Brett here. So we've just had the last day of the MS Virtual 2020 conference, coming a little bit after the first 3 days that we had, and today was the late breaking presentations, as well as a special session on COVID-19 and the impacts on people living with multiple sclerosis. So as I did with the other 3 days, I'm just going to record a short video now to provide some updates on some of the highlights of the talks that we heard tonight or today, depending on where in the world you are. So the late breaking session covered a variety of different topics and topics that we know that our community is interested in, which is fantastic. So one of the first talks that we heard was on remyelination, and we've heard of a few talks on remyelination throughout the conference. And this talk importantly added another bit of the puzzle, and again sort of covered one of the themes that I'd talked a little bit about in my other videos, and really emphasizing at the moment that we're at a stage with myelin repair where we're beginning to understand more and more about the parts of that puzzle that are important. And this presentation again was looking at the role of a specific type of cell known as an astrocyte, and how it may be important in helping the cells that create the myelin, the oligodendrocytes, mature. And so again, it's just another piece of that puzzle, and hopefully brings us closer to being able to get some myelin repair therapies. On the topic of myelin repair therapies, we also had trial data presented on a phase 2A trial on Bexarotene. Now, this was the trial that we published some brief information on yesterday, just around the general news on it that had been already published online before we were able to see the data. And so, having seen the data, there were a couple of points that are probably worth mentioning. So the first point is that in terms of this specific compound, Bexarotene, this isn't one that's going to be pursued any further in terms of being a potential remyelination treatment for people living with multiple sclerosis. Now, the main reason for that is that there were a number of adverse events that were found during this trial. So seeing the data and just checking some of the notes that I took down here, on average, people who were in the treatment arm of the study reported 6 adverse events during the course of the treatment. And so 100%, so everyone in the Bexarotene group had hypothyroidism. 1/3 of the people in that group developed neutropenia, and about 92% had hypertriglyceridemia. So obviously there were significant adverse events associated with the treatment, and so that's the reason why it's not going to be pursued any further. However, the interest in the trial and what was published, I guess, in a relatively positive light, and the article that we shared yesterday, is that they did see some information that suggests that this type of treatment approach may be an avenue that is worth pursuing in terms of looking for potential myelin repair therapies. Now, by that, what we mean is that the specific part of the process that they were targeting did show some potential. So what they did see was that while it didn't meet, the trial didn't meet its primary goals, they did see some evidence that remyelination was possible using this approach. They did see some significant results when they looked at lesions in specific areas of the brain and looked at whether myelin repair occurred in those areas. And in particular, they saw that this compound was particularly effective at causing remyelination in the grey matter compared to the white matter. And so the real outcome of this trial is that although Bexarotene itself is not going to be pursued as a myelin repair therapy, the authors think that there is enough evidence here to suggest that other compounds that may target a similar mechanism are worth pursuing to see whether or not they can still lead to these benefits in terms of myelin repair, but with less adverse effects. Following on from that, we had some more talks. We had another talk, on the gut microbiome. And this one in particular was looking at the gut microbiome in terms of pediatric MS, so children living with MS or people diagnosed with MS before the age of 18. And again, they were looking to see whether there were any differences in the microbiome that could be associated with relapses. They did see a couple of interesting little things. In particular, they found that the methane production pathway, bacteria associated with that, may be implicated in relapse. But really, probably the takeaway message from that talk is that while this is a big area of interest, there is still more work to be done in it. But certainly, again, some interesting results that are coming out of that, and we look forward to hearing more about it. We also had a talk looking at a novel imaging technique, so a novel MRI technique. And what was interesting about this study was that they found that using this sort of different imaging approach, they were able to have more sensitive detection of changes in the brain very early in the disease process. And they found that these changes also correlated with clinical issues. So this may be a technique that could be developed further so that really early on changes can be detected that may lead to better diagnosis or potentially being able to get on treatments and monitor treatments earlier. The last talk that we heard in the late breaking session was around pregnancy and the use of disease-modifying therapies in this area, and seeing whether or not serum neurofilament light chain, it's a bit of a mouthful, especially at this time of night, but you may have heard of serum neurofilament light chain before as a potential biomarker for measuring disease progression in multiple sclerosis. Now, to break that down a little bit, essentially a biomarker is something that can be measured really easily, that gives us some sort of a window or evidence as to what may be going on. So in essence, what people are hoping to do with serum neurofilament light chain, or NFL, as you may have heard it called before, is essentially to see whether or not the levels of it in the blood. So by using a simple blood test, we can look at the levels of this protein and use that to see whether or not the disease is progressing or whether things are stable. And so this specific study was looking at this in terms of pregnancy to see whether or not they could monitor any disease progression using this method once treatments had stopped during pregnancy. And what they found was that the levels of NFL did increase during the last trimester and in the first 3 months after having given birth, and that this was independent of relapses having occurred, so that there was some level of disease progression that could be happening behind the scenes, regardless of whether or not a relapse was experienced. So off the back of this, the researchers said that this may be something that's worth monitoring during pregnancy in people living with MS, women living with MS, and also to think more about in what context continuing to allow disease-modifying therapies during pregnancy may be warranted. And we've seen a number of other studies coming out in terms of pregnancy and MS at the moment, and we'll look to continue to provide updates on this area because we know that it is an area of interest for a number of people in the MS community. So that was the late breaking session. We then had another session talking through some recent data that has been generated around the world regarding COVID-19 infections and people living with multiple sclerosis. So there were two real main themes that were discussed during this. The first one was really only touched upon in the first presentation, and that was looking at whether or not people living with MS were at an increased risk of contracting COVID-19, so whether they were at an increased risk of getting the infection in the first place. And this was a UK-based study. And what they showed was that there didn't seem to be any association between any factors related to MS and contracting the disease, although it has to be said that all of the data generated for that study was while the UK was in lockdown. So obviously during the lockdown, while people are self-isolating, their risk of getting the COVID-19 infection is already going to be reduced. So we may need to wait until some more data comes out on that once restrictions are eased to get a clearer picture on that at the moment. But the second theme that was discussed during the number of presentations that we got in that session was regarding the outcomes of a COVID-19 infection in people living with multiple sclerosis, both in terms of are they at risk of having a more severe outcome than potentially people in the general population, and more, are there any factors associated with multiple sclerosis that appear to be tied to a more severe outcome. And so there were, within that sphere, there were probably then two main outcomes of that as well. So the thing that all of the presentations that we heard today seemed to agree upon was that there were a number of factors that did seem to put people with MS at a greater risk of having a severe outcome if they did have a COVID-19 infection. And these appeared to be being of older age, having high levels of disability, having progressive MS, and having a higher rate of comorbidities. And there was suggestions that in particular cardiac comorbidities or obesity tended to produce worse outcomes. Now, I guess these aren't too dissimilar in terms of what we would consider to give worse outcomes of a COVID-19 infection. In the general population, we obviously know that older people are at risk of having worse outcomes, and those comorbidities as well. Obviously, those other factors that we talked about there in terms of increased disability and potentially progressive MS are MS specific. But at the moment, there's probably also a few questions around how they're tied to just the fact that they may also associate with having older age. The other thing that I guess is particularly important and was discussed at length across a number of these different studies was looking to see whether being on any specific disease-modifying therapy either increased the risk of having a severe outcome associated with a COVID-19 infection, or on the flip side, actually, it was a bit more protective. So early data on this, when COVID-19 was first going around the world, I guess suggested, well, our first hypothesis, let me take a step even and further back. First hypothesis was maybe that while people with MS may not be at an increased risk of contracting COVID-19, if you did contract COVID-19, being on therapy may put you at a risk of having a more severe outcome because you would be immunosuppressed and so may find it harder to fight off that viral infection. However, as more data came out, it actually seemed to be the opposite of that, and that being on an immunosuppressant medication may actually be protective against having that sort of severe outcome. And the thought around that was that it seemed to be that overactive immune response and the immune response trying to fight the virus actually is what was causing a lot of the severe outcomes that we were witnessing. As we start to get more and more data on this now from around the world, we're starting to be able to drill into this a bit more deeply. Now, what I would say is at the moment, based on the presentations that we had from various data sources that have been gathered around the world, that we still don't have quite a clear picture on this yet. What seems to be the case is that certainly being on no treatment increases the risk of having a severe outcome compared to a lot of the other treatments. What was presented tonight is that there is an indication that being on one of the B-cell depletion therapies, and this was rituximab and ocrelizumab, may increase the risk of having a severe outcome of a COVID-19 infection. And there was some data presented from a researcher from the University of Melbourne using data collected from around the world that suggested that being on one of these therapies tended to increase the risk of hospitalizations, of being admitted to the ICU, and potentially of needing to be put on a ventilator. Now, this was when compared against being on Tecfidera, I believe was the dimethyl fumarate was the standard that they were using there as the control. Now, in terms of those two, rituximab seemed to increase the risk more than ocrelizumab, where there was a more significant finding with the rituximab. Importantly, none of the treatments seemed to increase the risk of death in the MS population as a result of a COVID-19 infection. Now, the associations here with these B-cell depletion therapies wasn't consistent necessarily across studies, and so I think there is still work to be done in the area. We know that this is obviously going to be something that the community is going to want to hear more about, and so we will continue to provide as much information on this as we can, and we will be contacting researchers who gave these presentations to hopefully talk to us a bit more about what they've found. So that's the end of MS Virtual 2020, with day 4 now having come to a close with these late breaking sessions and the COVID-19 special session. We hope you've enjoyed our coverage so far of the highlights of the conference, but rest assured we are certainly not finished talking about all of the presentations that have happened. As we've already announced, we have done an interview with Professor Helen Tremlett from the University of British Columbia, talking about the multiple sclerosis prodrome, as well as a couple of other studies that she's working on at the moment. And we're excited to release this interview with you early next week. And that will also just be the start. We have some other exciting things that we're looking forward to announcing with you. So make sure that you stay tuned across all of the MStranslate platforms over the coming weeks as we continue to provide coverage of this conference and all of the interesting and amazing research developments that have been discussed by researchers around the world across these 4 days. So thank you for attention. Thank you for your engagement. If you do have any questions and anything that I've discussed in this video, please feel free to comment below the video and I will make sure that I respond to all of those questions as quickly as I can. Thanks, everyone.